Okay, let's make a start. So, good afternoon. Yeah. Post lunch, you know, everybody's got that little bit of food sitting in the stomach, and it gets a bit tiring. Yeah. Who's an Ansible customer? Most part, good ratio. So, my name is Hat Ansible, so I head up product management for the Ansible BU. Been at Red Hat just over 5 years.
I'm Katie Pickerley, and I head up product marketing in the Ansible BU, and I've been with Red Hat for about 7 years.
Yeah. So hopefully you attended the Ansible Fest keynote yesterday. So you've seen some of the stuff we've got. So I know who we are as well. You saw us standing on stage. Yeah. Right. So we want to talk about a few things in here. So we've gone through a lot of work in the last couple of years, and if I'm being completely candid with you, when you had Tower 3.8 or Ansible Automation Platform 1.2, you could run a playbook, and at the other end, something would happen. We made you go through all this change. We introduced containers and automation mesh, and we put Hub in, made it all super critical. You had to have all these components in the middle, and you can still run a playbook, right? But the wheel's smoother, shinier. Still falls off every once in a while, but it's still a better, nicer, shinier experience. But what it's really let us do is change the way we actually can start to build things for the future, right? So a lot of the stuff you've seen in the last couple of days, this is actually really nice for us from our side, because I can talk about something that's new. I can talk about something we're adding, right? Rather than something we're just changing and asking you to go through that cost of change. And that is actually really pleasant to us. Because I usually say this from a product management perspective. Nobody phones me up and tells me, hey, it's fantastic, it's working great. People phone me up and say, it's not working, it's broken, fix this, I want that feature adding, all right? So it's generally quite good, and what we're going to do in this, we'll talk through a bit of where we are in the roadmap. We're going to go into a huge amount of detail on all the features that we've got that are coming along. But AAP2 is there, it's going to have this nice trajectory of just continuous improvement. We'll keep doing those fixes, we'll take some of your RFEs, we'll fix the bugs, etc. Then I want to talk about what we're investing in, the things that we're seeing, what we see when we talk to you as users and customers, and what we see the market needing. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the longer term changes, the things that you're going to start to see us talking about in the next year or so. So I normally start with this slide. Now, you may have seen this slide in the deck if you had any of your Red Hat teams come and talk to you. What's the philosophy behind what we're trying to build as a product set with the automation platform? Remove repetitive tasks, right? Stop these things touching keyboards, right? As much as possible, only when necessary. How do you foster collaboration? It's always been a strong message of Ansible. How do you get more and more teams talking to each other? How do you get that interaction between those groups that typically were siloed? At the same time, you have to deal with the different nuances those teams require. What exactly does an individual team need, right? Compared to, what's a network team need compared to a storage team, compared to a Linux team, compared to a Windows team? Could be the same, could be different. Could be op model differences, could be team experience differences. But ultimately, it's about how do you get to those outcomes. Ansible's fantastic, right? Automation's great. But the outcome you get from the back of doing automation with Ansible is actually what you're trying to achieve. Trying to write playbooks that's the means, right, to the end. I want the outcome. But what's really important about this, this is all great for individuals, right, and individual teams. But then you have to add in this organizational persona. So who looks after the org? Right? What's the organization? What's your company, your department trying to do? You need coordination across all of those. So part of that theme is also how do you coordinate all those different teams and groups coming together? Our job is to try and build something that helps that happen for what you need to try and do. And the other side of this, and worry less about the specifics of what's going on these, but if you're that person at your organization that's at the top left-hand corner of that curve, you're going to get there regardless of what technology you have. But there's lots of people down the bottom right. Now, whether it's experience, skills gap, whether you haven't got the people, right? There's a lot of people that are less mature. And you can't do something that you don't know how to do. You can't just imagine. If osmosis was a great way for me to teach people, just walk around, touch everyone in the shoulder, and fantastic, we'd all know everything I know. It would be wonderful, right? Maybe not. But the point is, you want to get as many people further up that curve as possible, right? but in that controlled, coordinated, collaborative fashion. This is what we're trying to do. That more is me just trying to set the scene so you get an idea of what we're trying to achieve to help you do that work.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about these things a little bit more in depth when we go through the roadmap, but there's 5 key areas that we are looking at and that we're investing in for the future of automation. You heard about a few of those yesterday with the 2 keynotes, but the first is we're working on that comprehensive set of developer tooling. Rich is going to dive deeper into that, but how do we make it possible to create and build that automation that you need? Additionally, cloud deployment flexibility. So as of last year, you're able to actually transact and purchase AAP through the 3 major cloud providers. And we're working on ensuring to make sure that that experience is the same regardless of whether you deploy it on-prem or you transact it through those cloud providers. You heard about generative AI and Ansible Lightspeed. What we announced yesterday, and it's kind of flashy and fun, and you don't really get into the nuances. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what is going to be made available at the end of this month is the ability to have anybody interact with a tech preview service that is going to be the ability to generate playbook code. So at the end of the month, at the end of June-ish timeframe, you'll be able to actually interact with it within your Visual Studio Code experience. It is a limited set of capabilities, and it is a general foundation model, but you'll be able to do that towards the end of the month. So what we showed yesterday, you'll actually be able to touch and feel. Additionally, event-driven Ansible, we'll dive deeper into that, and then the secure automation supply chain, you'll be able to track your automation capabilities within the AAP platform. So. We talked just a little bit about this with the areas that we're investing in for the future. And so, as of today, you can deploy AAP on either RHEL or OpenShift, and you can, there's a managed offering, which is managed by Red Hat on Azure. The other 2, you can transact through the marketplace, but they are self-managed. I would say from a roadmap perspective, towards the end of the year, you might see some other managed offerings that are available.
You keep on to that, I'll use the cursors. Does that sort of view of the world look familiar to you for all the things that you have? You've got all these different, too simple, yeah. Well, we have to keep it easy to keep it on one slide, right? So
it takes a lot of work to get those logos, okay?
Yeah. You have all these different things, and you have all these different groups, and all these different groups operate in different ways, and they work in different ways, and you have different technology groups. Being that sort of central point, as you look at each of those areas, you buy other technologies that have automation in them. Let's look at cloud is nothing if not really good automation, right? That's the main purpose of it. Think about OpenShift. OpenShift has a whole boatload of automation built into it, but there's still a part where you have to interact with it and you still have to touch it, make it do the things you want to do. So as you look at all those different technologies we work with, you don't have to be thinking about Ansible being used in the same way in all of them. You have to also think about it being used in the way you need to use it in those places based on other choices you have made to combine it with. And that is a very fundamental part of what we're trying to get to. As you move around those, Edge has a different touch point with automation than data center, right, than cloud. But in all those places, you need to be able to automate those last steps, those parts that you need to be able to touch and make sure they work for the way you need them to. Right, so when we think about the now, think about what we've been doing, what I said with the AAP2, we typically think in like these 3 pillars around what the product does. The create, how do I create automation? What's the story I give for those tools, for those things to help write playbooks, write modules? Managing, right? Who's in a team that looks after a platform rather than uses Ansible? Well, I know you do, right? So that, right.
He raised his hand.
He did raise his hand, I know, yeah, I know. But he gives me crap, so I'm giving him crap back. So in the point that you have, you can do that, yeah. In that point in the management, right, a person who writes automation may also be someone who manages the platform. You may also never actually see the platform in work. You may only ever see the playbooks that you write, the pipeline that you push that playbook into through a project, and boom, that's it. It's off and gone. You may never care about how it scales. You just need to care that it does scale. right? That when I asked it to run on that device was automated, right? So as you go through these three areas, we think about those as three separate personas in how we look at the features and functions that we add, and that will sort of come out in what we talk about next. So from a content developer experience perspective, a big part of that, was mine, wasn't it? How do we get to the point that anybody that wants to be able to write automation can, right? And how do we make that as easy as possible? Ansible, right, is easier than a lot of other tools, but you still have to know what you want to do, right? And two, you still have to understand how Ansible works, right? In the same way you'd have to understand how a scripting language works or anything else that you were trying to use. So how do we get into those different places? And actually, if you think about it, like a VS Code extension, right? And that's where the light speed is going to be offered through. When we talk to network teams, most of them never use that. Most of them are just happy with the command line. As a broad sweeping generalization, so no offense to any network people in the room, right? Love the command line. So that's where they've lived for 20 years, really happy with that environment. Then we suddenly go, the only way you can do something is, by the way, if you go and start using this Visual Studio stuff. No, I don't like that, right? It becomes an inhibitor. So you have to make sure we need to be in the places where they are. And the way I always try and describe this is we want to give you as many opinionated ways about how to do Ansible as possible to take that weight off of you, but it needs to integrate into your workflow. And that's the same principle with this. I want to give you testing capabilities with Ansible Lint, Ansible Test, the Ansible Risk Insights in the future we'll mention a bit later. How to put all that together, give you opinionated ways to do that, but it needs to sit in those places where you interact with it. Right? So that's where the sort of developer experience comes in, and all that should push through those different tools to the point where it delivers it in a package that the platform can run. So in this case, building execution environments, building that content, pushing it into the platform.
So we have two different, some content that we're going to talk about here. We announced the validated content at Ansible Fest in the fall last year, if you were there. There's kind of two different things that you see here with the content. So what is it that you want to automate? And those are the certified content collections. Our ISVs and the folks that we work with, those partners, that content collection could be made up of plugins, docs, roles. It could be, there's a couple of different things that could go in there. We look at it actually, Emily on Rich's team used this as an example today. I'm going to share it with y'all. If you kind of look at the content collections as Lego blocks, right? It's like a box of blue Lego blocks. You can do what you want with it, right? You can make a house, you can make whatever you want, but it's still all blue Lego blocks. The validated content is more of that how. It gives you some expert paths towards doing it, and it might be my husband got me for Christmas last year, the Discovery Shuttle Lego set, and so I can make the Discovery Shuttle with that Lego set, or I could make something else with it because I have Legos to do something with it, but it gives me instructions on maybe how to build that Lego set. So there's a couple of specific things in the future with validated content, but right now you do have to be one of our certified content vendors to be able to submit validated content. And we have validated content in multiple areas: network, edge, cloud, infrastructure.
Yeah.
Am I missing?
I can't remember after that now.
So I'm really excited about what's available with the content. Do you want to walk through that?
Yeah, so similar thing. So basically, and it's also, anything we do here is also about giving it to you. So if you're the central team or a central group of SMEs around a topic, you may already share roles. But if you are working in a more federated model, the ability to have a hub show all those different types of content and let you also publish content yourselves to those, grab content from other certified partners. We're talking to a lot of our partners about them providing that validated content because, in a similar way, it's the difference between knowledge and guidance. Knowledge is the thing that you abstract away so you can use Ansible. The guidance is the way of how do you use Ansible. But it's good to get that information from the SMEs when you first start. You then change it and tweak it so that it works the way that you want it to work. But taking it from somewhere up front, that's the purpose, but it'll give you the same capability in-house as well. Now just think about some of the, I'm not going to go through all of these, important ones. Now, we're still looking at molecule support, although we think we're going to rewrite it. I get that question a lot. We've got the VS Code extension, we've got the closed beta of Lightspeed. Things like the developer container, right? These are the areas we want to get into, making it easier, again, extending the ways of making it easy to gain access. once we get to, now that Podman Desktop is out, we can start looking at support for Macs in a better way with the execution environment experience. How do we make it easier for you to write that content, have everything encapsulated in one environment you can just pass around to write that content? We've just released, if anybody uses RHSM and Satellite to entitle your devices for where you write your automation content, you'll know that if you try and attach just to use a rel box so that you can write something with Ansible Core and the tools, you take one node of subscription away from your overall managed node count, right, from a license perspective. We now have an Ansible developer SKU. So you can request from your team, your Red Hat account team, they'll give you an entitlement, which basically means you can just add just the dev tools to a rel device. If that's where your team does the work to write stuff, just attach those tools there, it gets around that quirk. We want to make it easier for you, just packaging those things up in a way, and then we can rev them at different speeds. The final one on this is also automation applications. This is something we're looking at just around the simple concept of saying, can I give you a distributed unit of automation compute with all the bits inside to run, and all you have to do is call into that execution environment and say, please run job 1, please run job 2. Let you then push that out and distribute around different use cases. This sort of fits more into an edge, potentially cloud serverless type deployment model as a sort of future viewing thing. But these are the sort of things to make life easier for you to be able to distribute that content around. From a content ecosystem perspective, there's certified content, there's validated content. This stuff tends to have a much shorter roadmap. Rarely can we ever commit to these because often it's a partner that's doing the work, so it depends when they do it. But continued automation hub is going to have more continued focus because of the things like light speed and making sure we have that source of content to work from. EDA, event-driven Ansible, adding in content will put more emphasis on hub. A lot of work there to try and make that better. Just trying to keep more of that stuff coming so you can do more automation. Let's move on to manage. Was this me? Oh, still me. Okay. Managing automation. Now, you may see a little cross in that box there. Anybody actually ever try the automation services catalog? Yeah, that's sort of the problem, right? So we've discontinued that piece of work, right? So unfortunately, I apologize if you are using it, right? But it was when we had to sit there and decide, do we want to invest more in EDA and Lightspeed or invest in a service catalog? And I guess if I ask the inverse question, who's got ServiceNow? And a lot of people's hands go up, right, I can't compete with that, right? We're never going to be able to build something that works as well as ServiceNow does for the level of complexity they can put in. So our investments have moved to EDA and Lightspeed. So we're not going to have a service catalog, but again, this idea of how do we think about managing the platform and managing the content that goes into the platform, that's a big part of the work. We've got a new web user interface. So in 2.4, we're going to move to a single UI for all of the interaction with the platform. So no separate hub, no separate EDA, no separate controller view, single UI, back-end services underneath that. In time, that will get us to a unified UX. So I think in 2.4, that web user interface will be a beta. You'll be able to choose to turn it on. I'm also going to try and bring the analytics screens from console.redhat.com down. Right, the data will still be up on console.redhat.com, but then you can use controllers RBAC to gain access to the analytics rather than having to give everybody access to Red Hat's credential system. So it will help get more access to that information, although we'll still need the data to process it up on the cloud. We've got a new subscription utility coming out to try and help with some of the more unusual, or probably more common, but unusual charging models that people like. If you're using ephemeral devices, that doesn't work particularly well inside controller. We work on that static inventory. There's a lot of work that needs to happen in that space, but one of the things that is really going to be useful is by having that utility separated from controller, we can build custom rules in that. We can then give you, and based on the commercial construct you arrange with us, we can tailor that utility to help you count and keep compliance, ignoring that little thing that says, hey, you're out of compliance because you've gone over a certain number of nodes. And we can remove that from bothering you when you're using the UI and actually have something else that can help with that compliance off on the side. Other things we're looking at, again, that long-term unified UX experience where everything comes together, but containerizing AAP. So not just OpenShift containerized deployment, on-rel, Podman, containerized deployment of AAP. This is very close. I don't think it will get into 2.4 because there's still some quirks around rootless containers. But the idea being single box, put everything down, put a second box out, move some of the containers around, right? Put a third box down, move some of the containers around. None of this reinstall all the other bits and pieces you have to do with the installer today. If we can get to that model, when you've got a smaller instance you want to spin up, you can do it on a single box. If you don't want HA and DR, you can do it that way. If you want to do it across a 20-node cluster, you'll still be able to do it that way, right? We'll give you that deployment configuration. But moving to a fully containerized deployment on RHEL via Podman is a way we see making it a lot easier for you to gain access to what the platform does. And we move to scale. This one was you.
No.
Yeah.
I'm just here to tell him which slides he has to do.
Okay, fair enough. Who's using mesh? Who's using automation mesh? Right, good. Now the thing is, this is the important part. We sort of made, when we did all the rework and we introduced mesh rather than isolated nodes, it was a lot of work, right? And it really excited our technical marketing folks. So we spent a lot of time talking about it. And everybody went, do I need it? That seems quite complex. And they go, well, you will at some point need it. When you start, you might not. And again, back to that containerized AAP, you just need a couple of boxes running hybrid mode. But then mesh gives you that ability to start to spin those things out. So when you do need geographical diversity in your deployment options, when if you're a large organization with a UK or US data center in Argentina or South Africa, you don't want to be talking over SSH to those things. You want to be able to have a point of presence out to do that. When you think about edge, it becomes even more important. Cloud, different network zones. Making that far more asynchronous was super important to us just to help with the scalability. So there's a whole bunch of stuff we're doing there. One of the things we've also done around the scale is this bulk API improvements. As people get much more heavily invested, and then you start to get to bringing in large numbers of servers at a single time, having to manually add each one into the system, a little bit arduous. How about I can just add 10,000 at a single time, bang. So trying to get the bulk API into work, helping with the constructed inventories came out. I think the tech preview was last month. So making that easier to manage all those different devices you've got across those groups. And this is, again, just generalized sort of usage sort of capabilities that we're going to add into the product. So I'm breezing past those because I want to get to the more interesting stuff later. So that's just the now. If you'd seen that roadmap 6 months ago, it would have sounded just like any other roadmap. Now I want to talk about some of the other stuff that I think is actually we're enabling ourselves to do on top of what the platform changes have been. Trusted supply chain. Who's got a CISO who likes the concept of trusted supply chains? Right? SolarWinds, Log4j, all the fun stuff that causes lots of headaches. Now the thing is, I don't want to build a trusted supply chain in Ansible. Right? That we are not the product to be the trusted supply chain. But I want to make sure that Ansible has a trusted supply chain capability that integrates into your approach to doing so. So for the moment, and my request here is try some of this and give us feedback. Right? What we've done is introduce at various points a verification check. Is this content signed by a certificate that I trust? Right? Is it by your certificate authority? You could trust Red Hat, you could trust the partner, you could trust yourselves, right? However you want to do it. And at each step of that process, we say, only download signed content from Red Hat. Only put signed content from us, from your company, inside an execution environment. Don't allow signed content or non-signed content into production, but only allow it into development. What if my project's not signed? If I've got a business critical system, would I want to run an unsigned project against it? Again, if you want to apply that level of discretion to that, you can apply those capabilities to the various gates along that process. Decide where you want to assert that trust. Now it's your turn.
Oh, my turn. So this is just a highlight. We know that the generative AI inflection is upon us. And I would actually argue that there's kind of two things happening at the same time. Living in a little bit of our economic conditions that we live in today, automation inflection point is also happening. And so the fact is that there's not enough of all of you out there to deliver on the amount of automation that leaders and businesses actually want to deliver on. And so at the same point in time, if you add in generative AI, hopefully we can kind of maybe close the gap in some of those areas. And so we've been looking at this. We announced Project Wisdom at Ansible Fest in 2022. And this has now, so if you've heard about Project Wisdom, it is now Ansible Lightspeed with Watson Code Assistant. And so Ansible Lightspeed is the Red Hat Ansible version of what we're doing, and it is a bundle with IBM. And so IBM has Watson Code Assistant. They announced Watson X at IBM Think 2 weeks ago. And Watson Code Assistant is actually one of their first foundation models that comes out of the Watson X experience. So we've integrated that into this experience to be able to give generative AI to our Ansible users here. This is what you can kind of, this is just a look of exactly what it looks like and what's the difference between what is IBM and what is Ansible. Ansible Lightspeed actually also has some post-processing that comes with it. If you know anything about using some generative AI tools, the result isn't always maybe syntactically correct. And so there is post-processing that comes in that allows for it to be actually aligned to best practices that we have for writing code. These are some of the capabilities that you're going to see in the tech preview that's going to come out next month. It is just task generation, so it isn't going to write a full playbook for you. It'll be task generation by line. So you can build a playbook, but it's not going to give you a full playbook. Does that make sense? So these are all the things that comes with it. It's the Granite model foundation model from IBM. It is a generic model. Lots of people ask questions. The PII is actually scraped out of it. So if you were to use it, there is actually no private data that goes into the model. It is all scraped out. And so we will always attempt as well, if you saw the demo, we will always actually attempt to do, some people call it attribution, we call it content source matching. That's a lot of question that comes out of generative AI is like what's the result? Who is it attributed to? What does it mean? And so we will actually give you the attribution results of where that training data came from. And so it's definitely an amazing experience. So next slide there. This is the roadmap, just as a side note, for what's happening with Lightspeed and Watson Code Assistant. There is a closed beta that is happening right now. There's about 500 people in the closed beta. And the tech preview will open up sometime at the end of June. And then in the fall, we're looking at actually the commercialization of what does the enterprise offering look like. There's some additional roadmap features that will come later on as part of the commercial offering. Like I said, we've got content generation, what's what you saw maybe yesterday. We'll be able to discover a playbook that's similar to what you're looking and writing. You can actually do some optimization of your playbook. And then my favorite is content explanation. In the future, you'll be able to drop a playbook in, and actually it'll tell you what's happening in natural language. So really excited about what's coming with that. You want to go? You want to do it?
That's me. Yep. I should go back once. I'll go back once.
Sorry.
So what I didn't say is when I thought about the future, I had that create, manage, scale, and let's just go its path. For the future investment, we're thinking more about how do we accelerate you. That ties well to that AI story. You know, if you think about using AI, when we started automating, I had a 2-month process to get a VM built, you know, with all the different chains in that link, you know, the links in that chain. That's the right way around. Got that down to 2 hours, 2 days, that sort of time frame based on whatever you've managed to do. We've got a 2-hour task to write a playbook, get down to 20 minutes. Same concept, different scope, right? One's on the user, one's on the system. It's the same principle being applied time and time again. How do we get you to be able to do something, more of something in the same time frame with the same people, right? And the same number of hours in the day without having to work for those times. So that's the accelerate part. When it comes to that manage part, now we want to start thinking about how do we integrate into the wider ecosystem of management solutions. You know, Ansible's established, it's there, it's that thing you use and rely on. How do we get it so that it actually talks as well as possible to all those other systems that you also use to manage your infrastructure across the organization? This is where event-driven Ansible came from. Right. Who wants to say they've done event-driven automation? Because I do get this from customers, yeah, you see. You get a few hands, tentative, yeah, see my hand up, right? But the thing is, you have to stitch it all together yourself. You've got to write to the API, you've got to do all these things, you've got to go and find where the sources are, suck all the information out of them. What if we could do the same thing with Ansible, make that part in the middle a lot easier for you? And that's what those sort of like lighthouse customers who have worked with us have sort of proven. Rip out all that internal plumbing you had to do, put EDA in the middle, and it deals with the same modular architecture that made Ansible really useful for talking down to technology. We flipped that on its head and made that talking out to sources of events. So adding that sort of the ability to act based on what observations are being made elsewhere in the system, and then take a response, that becomes an important changer in making Ansible be applicable in more places, lets you use it in more places, take more advantage, and it's the same investment. You've already got the product. This gives you more usage of the same product and capability. And we get a lot of use cases. Now, if I'm remembering where the slides are, let's think about a few silly examples. So, anybody got high performance compute? Yeah. A couple of thousand servers. Yeah. North. Yeah. 10,000. Yeah. Good. Right. So, yeah, some good big numbers, right? And we're talking to a bank, and every time they do a BIOS upgrade across that HPC grid, which they've got to do at the same time on a weekend, once a month, 2, maybe 4 of those servers don't restart after the BIOS upgrade. And every month, that one poor sod has to sit there and wait for the call to figure out which 4 servers haven't started. All he has to do is poke the iDRAC port. Sorry to mention Dell. Poke the iDRAC port on that box, it starts back up again every time. They've never had one not start after the second poke. He's been doing that for 3 years. That's a really good example of something you could just put into EDA, right? If that doesn't start up after the thing, poke it, it starts up, I'm good, carry on. You haven't been called out. This is about taking out that mundane task that you have to do. Just removing those simple things that just cause you time and effort break. Think about, if you're actually doing something important, you like to get into a zone and start thinking about it, and if every 15, 20 minutes somebody's poking you saying, hey, this isn't working, how quickly do you get the task done? Not as fast as if you actually just had a clean run at that piece of work. Just taking those sorts of things out. This is where it comes into handy, and it can be applied across the board. There's so many different ways we see, application goes down, run a trace route by default. My biggest use case I always think of is back in my day when I used to do support, I always would go and look in the same 5 places. I'd always go and look at the same stuff, and then I'd make my mind up about what I was going to investigate next if I didn't see what the answer was going to be. So why not just say, hey, something's down, run the same pieces of discovery that I would otherwise do, pull it back, stick it in my ticket. I might even be able to phone up the ops desk and just tell them to restart something and not have to worry about getting access and logging on. Now, if you're on call, that's quite useful. But then think of those crit sits you have where suddenly you're on a crisis call for 6 hours with a whole load of people, and you're just taking a long time to get the next person on to then go and find out how long it takes them to go and log on, gain access, search for the same things. You can find all that the second that you want. You can automate that type of activity. Those things become super useful, and it's just, again, about making it more applicable across the board. Whole list of plugins, stuff on the my left, my right, your left. On the left-hand side, these are things we're working with our partners, a bunch of stuff that we've been writing as well ourselves, so talking into the various transports, Kafka, MQs, etc. Obviously, some of the partners we've been working with, you've seen Dynatrace in the demos, IBM Instana, Splunk, AppD, again, all work. Those partners have all been interested in how to do this because they want to be able to enact automation off the back of what they see, but they're not the trusted source of running automation, they're a trusted source of observation. We can't see what they see, but we're the trusted source of automation. Marry those two things together, that's the purpose of that. And then the final one, scale. So the real big part of this is that edge piece in the middle top there. Most of the stuff around this you'll have seen us talking about for many years. We need to be able to run across all of these because you operate across all of these. So when I think about that scale part at the end, we want to make sure that we can be where you need us to be. That includes operating on the clouds through the marketplaces, being able to deploy in all those clouds, being able to deploy across the edge. in whichever way you want, you need to be able to automate in all those places. We need to be where you want us to be for automation. That's just a generalized continuation of that. How long are we doing time-wise? Because now I'm just going to riff on a bunch of little things I've wrote down.
5 minutes if anyone wants a question.
5 minutes. Yeah, so let me do some of this for lifecycle change. Who likes the fact that we have a life cycle of 18 months? Not even one hand, wow. What a surprise. I want to move us to annualized releases, right, which means that we will release once a year rather than every 6 months, and also have that life cycle go to 3 years. So we're starting to work on that. There's a whole load of work in the background around processes, around life cycling, around dependency tracking, and aligning that with the RHEL team and making sure all the bits that we need to be are there. But I want to give you longer time because I know how hard it is when we release a new version of the product and it takes you 6 months to look at it, then it takes you 6 months to certify it, and then you're nearly out of support. So that's a big part of how we want to do that. Separating out the core execution environment life cycles from the platform. So those things will just run and have a life cycle, maybe slightly longer than the platform. We'll choose that based on RHEL, how we use it with RHEL and where we've got other use cases we need it for. But the platform will run along in that annualized space. Core will just land when we choose to land it, and we may change that as well. But with that comes the need for a change on our side. So what we call Z-Streamless. We're going to stop having those Z-Stream releases. We actually did this on the last release, where we won't have a release every 2 months, whichever thing comes along in. We want to be able to release a new version of any of the components as and when they're available to use. You choose when you adopt them. What that means is we can also add features into the product as we go. This suits the sort of future cloud deployment model paradigm that we'll be getting to as well, so that when you have a version in and a new version of controller comes with a bug fix or a feature release or an enhancement that's non-disruptive, we can just add it. And we'll define some rules around what we consider to be a disruptive release. Like, for instance, on controller, we won't mess with credentials. On hub, we won't mess with RBAC. And on EDA, we might not mess with rulebook activations, right, just as examples. But the idea being we should be able to release quicker for you as we go through the year and get you access to those changes and enhancements rather than waiting for the next release. And it'll give us more time to spend doing those fixes. From a manageability perspective, we separated the control and execution. We need to separate the control and management of controller. More and more of you are deploying multiple controller instances in different locations for different purposes. What if we could give you a capability of managing the configurations of those in a way that you could distribute those out to different teams, but they wouldn't have full admin rights to the cluster, they just have org rights to the cluster, so that you don't have to deal. They can do the runtime, but you're managing it from a separate location. This is something we're interested in. Subcontroller is an edge sort of based use case, but the idea is saying, on that same model, push out an instance, stick it over in some other location. Everybody can talk to that directly. They don't have to come up to the main unit in the data center or the main controller instance. Just talk locally, integrate. Now think about anybody that's involved in any data residency in Germany. You can't have certain things outside of the German market. Therefore, it has to be located there. But you might want to call it from the US. But you can put that controller instance in there. It's still bound to the larger main instance you've got where all your pipelining stuff happens. But it's got localized logging, it's got localized credential access, all those sorts of things. So helping distribute that control layer out in different ways gives you more flexibility. Execution environment build as a service. Constant thing we hear, builder is not as easy to use as we would like it to be. We want to integrate a builder service into hub so you can do the lifecycle management of all those components and push that through. And as I said about this, the user experience and the central UI, have a bunch of central services with RBAC, security and telemetry, so someone helping with some of that node counting sort of stuff. We talked about compliance and licensing. How do we put those in a single place that all the other components use those same common services? And then the last one, automation creation. Ansible Risk Insights, another feature that will get added. This is scanning through the playbooks that you've got, running all the way down, checking all the dependencies of all those collections and those modules and all the Python bits, trying to identify where you may have something you're not happy with about wanting to use, or making sure that you are, when somebody writes a playbook and ships it to you, have they used all the right versions of the things that you would like them to use? Content Builder, which is more about creating modules, right? So sort of like scaffolding for module creation. External workflow, we're thinking about taking that workflow out and having a more developer-focused user case around the workflow, so you can push that back into controller, and Ansible blueprints. Now, these are much further ahead, these last two. I think blueprints are an anti-pattern, right? Not because you shouldn't do them, but because the way that we've historically done them in products always leads to a rigid approach that only lets one team control whatever can happen. I think we can use Ansible in a more flexible way, or the same principles of Ansible, to build better workflows and blueprints, which means that you can, and how you can construct those things together and sort of manage a data model behind it. Some of the stuff we're starting to think about that's further ahead. I think we've got a good chance to change the way those historical tools dealt with things like blueprints and workflow and give you something that actually gives you the same value and power that Ansible has, but in a way that works for those different user groups that don't need to just aren't happy with YAML or the command line and still want that visual sort of side of things. So that's where we're at to. This is the last slide. So think about what we said at the beginning. Remove repetitive tasks, fostering the collaboration, nuanced need of teams, and focus on those desired outcomes. That's the roadmap we've got. That's the roadmap we're building. I get more, these events are the things that start to trigger more thoughts up here. So the next time you see a roadmap, you might see some of the things you've mentioned to some of the product team or the marketing teams when you've had conversations with us, because we absorb what you tell us. That's where we're at the moment. We think we've got a good path at the moment to sort of address these concerns. And like I say, feel free to chat to us at any point.
We have 1 minute if there's a question.
1 minute for a question. We will be around for questions for a few minutes afterwards as well. Question at the back first. I'll come back to you in a second. Yep.
Regarding workflows, I'm not sure if I know the latest AAP platform version, but in the version we have already, the workflows, if they went and get broken, it's not possible to continue the workflow at the point it was broken. So we can rewrite it from the beginning.
Yep.
And so on.
That's part of that. That's part of that story. We hear that a lot for. Yeah, it's great that the tasks can be rerun, and obviously if you're using Ansible once, you just go over and it'll just skip over those tasks. But if you're 999 servers through a 1,000 server run and then it breaks on the last task for those workflow, it'd be nice to start there rather than start right at the front. So that's one of those things we're looking at how to do. And maybe we'll do like a checkpointing at some point along it, so we've got a recovery point to go back to. So we'll still maintain the same behavior. Maybe we'll start from 950 and then push forward, but it still isn't full 1,000. That's the sort of stuff we're thinking about. Other question down here.
Sure. So my question is around license.
Yeah.
Is there a roadmap to train the model to be able to pick up custom modules and collections?
Yes. So as a part of the commercial offering, you'll be able to bring your own private data, and you'll be able to actually train your own model to be able to deliver best practices to your organization. So if you take a look at the keynote with Arvind at Think 2 weeks ago, I did a demo of the prompt tuning of private data to be able to build your own model.
I think that becomes a really important part of what enterprises will need for AI, because there's a few variants in this. But if you think, how happy is your security team going to be if in an open model they can see that you're searching for how to do a certain network device automation, right? That then becomes attributable to you as a user and and at the moment they basically say, don't do anything with private information, right? Because we have no model and no policy. Those are all attack vectors that we have to consider. And it's just, I always equate it to the same thing as Google Translate. You know, so if you worked in a bank or you are working in a bank, and like 10 years ago, they said you're no longer allowed to use Google Translate because Google terms and conditions say any data you put into this service belongs to us. And then some employee doesn't know that when it's in French that it's actually PII information. When you translate into English and suddenly realize the error message was customer record X could not be added to database Y, right? Suddenly that information is then in the hands of the service provider. Being able to have that stuff in your situation where we provide the trained model, you then influence the model, and that private model becomes yours, so you know what's in it.
Yeah, there's a generic model that is currently trained on Galaxy data. And anybody who has data there can opt out. We can pull it out. There's no problem at all. The generic model has some additional stuff in it from Red Hat that from our stuff that we've been able to pull in to help train that generic model. When you use the tech preview service, that's the generic model. From an enterprise perspective, your data will be trained on top of that model, but it stays separate. So it all stays in your organization and never goes back into the model.
One more question, then we're going to go next door because we've got, I'm going to go down front. So.
Are there any plans for EDA to support
Sort of, right? And yes, it's one of those ideas we know that file system events are there. Where it will sit, and if I go back a few, I don't know, where it sits in that list, loading facts from YAML, from file. So command line is definitely a no from a support perspective, but file, like having lines added to files, is something that we do see has been interesting. So like if certain things come into a log, you can do it, but the question is, how do you generate it? So that's the only thing to sort of consider with that one. Yeah. So yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different ones they're thinking of. The question is when it will appear. Right, so. Yeah. Well, I hope that was useful. I know people have left because we ran late. So if you go into the ops as code session, we're next door in the bigger room. So we'll be moving over there now. And we'll see you in a minute.
Thanks.